Are you feeling lost in this crazy business environment and wondering if your business can survive whatever's going on in our economy, the election, and who knows what's going to happen in the next 6 months? So this week, I'm diving deep with my husband, Scott, who is the finance whiz, to uncover two crucial strategies for navigating uncertainty. One, really understanding a long-term vision and personal roadmap, because it's not just about the money. And we're going to talk about how to create a plan that thrives regardless of the economy. And two, data-driven decisions. So we're going to talk about our secrets for understanding economic indicators and past performance indicators to make smart business choices. Plus, we're going to talk about my favorite topic, income stacking, cost-effective marketing, and launch tips you can use right now. So if you're ready to recession-proof your business, let's go. Welcome back to this week's Pep Talk. It's a super fun episode because I have brought back my husband, Scott. So if you're watching our YouTube video, it's a very special episode. But on this week's podcast, I thought it would be really helpful to chat about what is actually happening in today's economy in terms of there's an election coming. Summer is a little bit slower. I know we're sort of moving into fall. Maybe you're in a recession. I don't really know what we call it. And I always joke that because we started our business in 2020, that I've only had a business in some sort of financial crisis, pandemic, or recession. So we're going to dig into how to election and recession proof your business and really talk about some of the things behind the scenes that have helped us the most. So first things first, typically summer is a little bit slower for most businesses. However, it's actually a season where you can grow quite a bit. So the things that I like to really focus on is taking two stances on what's happening in the economy and thinking about how you can adapt your business to it. So the first thing that we teach is to really focus on a long-term plan, right? So it doesn't really matter what's happening this quarter or what's happening this month, but really focusing on what's happening long-term. So I always say time is money. And if you take the money out of it, what do you actually want to be doing? So what does your dream schedule actually look like? We talk about that a lot. But really thinking truly, what do you want to do 5 years from now, 10 years from now? What do you actually want to be doing? So that's the first perspective of, regardless of the season or what's happening in the economy, what do you actually want to be doing? And then create a long-term business roadmap. I would like to think that's what our product suite teaches you to do, and a personal plan that can really upstand the ups and downs. But this is where Scott comes in, and he really talks about, everyone has their days as an entrepreneur, and you see something or something doesn't go the way you plan and you panic and you're like, oh my gosh, I shouldn't do this. It's not working. And then you kind of come back to everything is cyclical, which is why I think this episode is so important. So for those of you who don't know Scott or haven't met him, he actually comes inside our mastermind a little bit and talks about our finances and what's happening in the economy and things that we're doing. He actually has a master's in economics and education, and behind the scenes does all of our financial support. So really stepping into the CFO role and our support tasks. So he's probably emailed you a few times. And one of the things that we've talked about a lot as a family, but also behind the scenes in our mastermind, is these economic indicators and what's happening in the economy and how you can apply that to your business, which brings me to number two, right? So if you're following along, how do you sort of recession-proof your business? One, you have a long-term plan, but two, you use data to understand the environment that you're in. And we do this in two ways. One, we always do what I call a look-back analysis of what worked and what didn't in the past. So you're continuing to do the things that worked, but you're also looking at things that didn't, so you can stop doing them. And number two, we're looking at economic indicators. Now, this was something I did not do by myself, although I would argue I was taught this in business school and totally forgot about it, like most of us do. So that's why I wanted to bring Scott in, because that's where he's helped me the most and has been able to help some of our clients really understand what this looks like and how it can help your business really in any season. So my first question for you is, what do you think the most helpful thing we do each quarter when we look at our numbers?
Well, I think first, to throw Holly off every time, I never really answer the question. And I've been sitting here trying not to talk for the last couple minutes, and now I have so much on my mind that with everything she just said. But I think starting off, I think the first thing we have to remember is that everything is cyclical. Holly alluded to it. Everything kind of goes from step to step, season to season, and you have to always keep that in mind as you're working through things. Things are never going to stay low or too high for any given period of time. It's a roller coaster. So kind of knowing where you are at any given time is the first place to start. So when we look at our numbers, there's several things that I look at over the, looking at the big economy or the nation's economy, so that we can get a better understanding of how that's impacting our particular business. The first thing we talk about are interest rates, and everybody gets sick of hearing about that. And, I get kind of the doom and gloom part of the job and basically saying, hey, how are interest rates impacting our business? Well, one of the things you have to understand is more people are carrying more debt right now than any other time in our nation's history. So when you look at that, interest rates didn't rise instantly. It happened over a period of about a year and a half. So when you look at that, things are just now starting to really impact people. So when we look at numbers, from a national perspective, interest rates are kind of like the first place that we start.
When we look at what our numbers are for the quarter, what do you think is the most helpful?
Probably, we love to see profit, right? Profit is the ultimate goal of any business. So, there's kind of this 30-40-30 idea of, your business shouldn't have more than 30% of your revenue be allocated to payroll, 40% expenses, and then 30% hopefully profit. Not all of us get to do that each month, but we look at that kind of as a general guideline as what you're aiming for. So, that's the bottom line. You want to be able to pay yourself. So look at those numbers and say, hey, how close are you to that 30-40-30 principle?
Yeah, I think the other thing that we do that's really helpful, and you actually reminded me of this before we did the interview. It's our first video, by the way, so it's new. Is really thinking about not necessarily month-to-month numbers, but year-to-date numbers. Can you talk about that a little bit, about what we look at?
Well, it's not just year-to-date, obviously. Going back to kind of creating great habits using data, really you kind of need to look at this almost week to week as opposed to month, because, you have to be planning at all times. You can't be surprised by anything. You'll see the trends start to develop. But, when you compare, year to date, we look at year to date from even 2 years ago, and how are we doing? Where are our gains? Where are we spending more? So we're kind of looking at all those things. Do we look at all of them weekly? No. Monthly, we're looking at month to date, this month compared to the same time last year, and maybe even the year before that. So it's all those things together that help us kind of make sure we're headed on the same path and there's no real surprises.
Yeah. And so I think if you're taking notes, you're like, okay, I don't really know what's going on in the economy right now. The number one thing you can do is make sure you have a long-term plan. So it's not just short what's happening this month. But the number two thing is to use data. And one of the things that we do with our data is do a look back analysis, what worked before, what didn't, and revisiting it frequently. I know another thing that we've talked about, we actually just had, we have a co-op call inside our mastermind, and we've talked about this a couple of months in a row, and that is just understanding some economic indicators. One of the things that you talked about was interest rates, but there's a couple other things that we like to just take a peek at. And again, it doesn't mean you have to change your long-term plan. It just means you're aware of what's going on and you're looking at the data and you're making decisions based on the data. So can you share what those economic index numbers are and maybe some other things that we look at besides interest rates?
Okay, so I mentioned interest rates. I also mentioned making sure you're aware that as a nation, we're carrying more debt month to month than than at any time in the nation's history. And then the other one that I look at, and you usually see this come out about the third to fourth week or Thursday of each month, and that's the University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment. And what that kind of gauges is how the general consumer is viewing the economy. Is it viewed more favorably or less favorably? And what we've seen over the last several months is a steady drop in that. And that's basically just everybody's kind of spending habits. I know as a business, we've kind of seen some fluctuations on even, whether it's lower ticket items or higher ticket items. We're seeing it kind of across the board, and people are just generally being more cautious. And again, that kind of relates back to the political environment right now in the country, a general measure of insecurity and uncertainty as to what people think is going to happen. So that consumer sentiment number just gives you an idea of how broadly people are feeling. And that's, again, over time. So right now we're seeing a general month over month, about 4 months in a row now, we've seen a drop. So that's kind of like the main one that I look at relative to, again, we're looking at this over a long period of time. So it's not, none of this should be a surprise. If you're keeping up with your numbers monthly and really probably weekly, you'll see all this in your numbers before they ever come out with it. So it's just kind of having that good relationship, not just from a national level or looking at national data, but relating it then to your personal business numbers.
Yeah. So last but not least, I know you guys like when we do sort of behind the scenes. So we have quarterly meetings with our team, and we sit down and we do this look back analysis, and we look at our monthly progress, and we make decisions based on that, which hopefully you're hearing and are starting to find some habits that you can incorporate into your schedule. So my last question is, what do you think has helped us create I'll say, recession-proof business?
Well, it's going to sound like I'm just repeating myself over and over again, the same things, but it's really knowing our numbers and again, not being surprised. We've kind of predicted this. Holly's kind of been a little more worried over the summer months. But again, if we look back, not only this year, but we can look back, the 2 previous years at least, and see some of these same trends. Are we seeing them a little bit bigger this year? Yes, we're seeing them a little bit bigger. But again, it's having that intimate knowledge of your numbers in order to be able to recession-proof things. It's not just knowing what income might be coming in if things are a little slow on that. But hey, if God forbid you need to start cutting more expenses, which ones can you afford to cut or put on pause for a little bit so that if things are a little bumpy, you can kind of even them out? And I think that's, again, it's not just one thing. It's knowing your income, knowing your expenses, how they mesh together, and which ones you kind of need to adjust. The more you know this, the more you know your numbers, the easier those decisions will be. And that basically will recession-proof, if I can say it right, recession-proof itself.
Yeah, and I can give an example. So typically July is one of the slower months for us, not because of what's going on in the economy, but because we just know that based on what's happened in the last few years, which is why we do things like Christmas in July and why we've rolled out different offers. So it's actually been, I think, our second or third highest month of the year because we were able to look at the data and make decisions based on that of like, hey, we got to do something different this month because typically this is what happens. So the other thing that I really like to share behind the scenes is this really does go back to our income stacking strategy and being able to use data to make decisions, which you're hearing over and over again. But I do think there's some tried and true growth strategies that have always worked. One is focus on value and customer retention. So one of the things that we actually had a conversation about this morning was let's look at that 80-20 rule. Like, let's look at our super fans and think about how we can serve them better instead of thinking about, hey, I need to find 10 new people. Focus on 10 people that you already have and how you can give them an amazing experience. The second thing that we have done is really get creative. Scott hasn't been on the podcast since, I don't know. When was the last time you did an interview? It definitely wasn't video. We weren't that far.
Too much, so.
It was, I don't know, probably 2 years ago. But I looked back at our podcast numbers and I was like, hey, what did we do a couple years ago that really worked? We used to do this more often. And so I was like, hey, let's do it today. The girls are at a pool date. Let's do a video. So really thinking about what can you do that's currently working, and then income stacking to think about how can you take what you have and make more with less. So if you go to hollymariehaynes.com/profit, we actually have a free class on this that we just redid. Again, going back to do less better, right? And what's working. This is what's working. And then last but not least, and I'll let Scott share this a little bit more, but really embrace, I would say, adaptability and cost-effective marketing. That's like your favorite line of like, how can we be more cost effective? So really looking at, you can always decrease your expenses, but you can also increase what's working. So does anything come to mind when you think about that in our business that's helped us the most?
I really think looking back over the last 2 years to anticipate what was coming, I think there were two parts to what we were looking at. We were looking at the national data, which was telling us, hey, things were slowing down. We were also looking at, hey, over the last 2 years, we've seen this in the summertime. So we kind of knew that. And then you add that into, okay, what is it that is not maybe as efficient as we'd like it to be in terms of our expenses and things of that nature. And I think we saw, over the past years, we've seen where maybe putting something into advertising and things of that nature wasn't as effective as maybe we'd hoped it would be. And so that helped us be more efficient this year in terms of pushing those resources elsewhere. I think it's hard to say one has been much more effective than the other, but at least from the advertising standpoint, it wasn't necessarily as fruitful because people, I think, are holding on to their dollars a little bit tighter right now than what we've seen historically.
Yeah. And I think the other thing is we're constantly looking at our expenses and looking at, is it getting us a return on investment or do we need to adjust? I would say the other thing that we've done is really looked at our launches and our calendar. I know I share behind the scenes, like one of the things that we do every quarter is really look at like, what do we want our schedule to be? Where do we want to go on vacation? What does that look like? And giving ourselves a longer runway to prime our audience. So instead of just being like, oh, we're going to do this free thing next week, like really working backwards and saying like, what did we do last year? What did it look like? And my favorite word of the season is really presenting yourself as a thought leader. So when I thought of this podcast episode and I thought about, well, what would help you the most? Like, how can I personally for our business be a leader in this space so that you can grow more, and really thinking about how can you create content that presents yourself as a thought leader so that when people are ready to spend, you're there. And then last but not least, and I just shared this in office hours earlier, and Scott was laughing at it. He was like, you guys look like you were having a good time up there, is think about yourself as a Taylor Swift concert, right? Like you've got to create your own lane and you've got to create your own momentum, and you can look at the data, but you also have to turn it off. Like you have to say, hey, this is our plan. This is what we're doing. And then you have to execute the plan. Because if you're changing the plan over and over and over again, you're never going to have the right steps. You're never going to be able to figure out what actually worked. Any other pieces of advice that you'd like to share?
I think the thing is, don't panic. I said this in the mastermind the other day. It is, the numbers may be a little gloomy right now. Some of what I've said today is a little gloomy, but you just stick with it. The tide will turn. We see it turn every fall. August is typically a quiet month for us. I'm not saying it is in all businesses, but it just has been. It starts picking up after Labor Day. End of September, early October have been great months. So just hang with it. Be patient. Know your numbers. Be prepared. And, it'll turn around.
Yeah. So my last piece of advice on this topic is have fun. And really just think about what can you do that's going to make you excited about your business for the long term, right? This isn't like a 1 month, a 2 month, a 3 month strategy. This is, can I do this for 4 or 5 years? I was actually just giving the example the other day of like, create something that you could do for 5 years. I had no idea this podcast would be 4 years old, but here we are. And maybe this is fun. I don't know. I think we were a little stressed to do a video. Be patient.
I'll get better.
We were a little stressed to do a video at first, but we're here, right? And so it's like, be a thought leader, be consistent, look at your data. And if you'd like to hear more he said, she said topics, maybe we'll bring them back. You can shoot me a DM and let me know what you thought of this episode, but also go to hollymariehaynes.com/profit. We've got a masterclass all about how to increase your revenue in any season. And I can't wait for you guys to listen to it. Thank you.
Thanks.